It is often assumed that once a woman became a prisoner of war in the Second World War, her treatment followed a clearly defined medical standard, shaped by international law and supervised by neutral oversight. That assumption survives largely because it is convenient. It suggests that suffering, where it occurred, was accidental or exceptional. The historical record tells a more complicated story. In many camps, medical care was not simply inadequate. It was deliberately subordinated to labor needs, security priorities, and administrative indifference. One female prisoner's documented medical condition, recorded not in memoir but in routine camp paperwork, offers a rare and instructive window into how those systems functioned in practice. The woman appears briefly in the surviving files. She was in her late 20s, classified by camp authorities as a civilian internee rather than a frontline combatant, held in a detention complex administered by a military command, but staffed largely by auxiliary personnel. Her name is not essential to understanding her case. What matters is that she entered captivity without any major chronic illness noted on intake forms. According to registration records, she was described as fit for light labor. Within less than a year, she was reclassified as medically unfit, her condition used repeatedly as justification to reduce work output rather than as a reason for treatment. To understand why this mattered, it is necessary to step back from the individual file and consider how medical systems inside prisoner of war camps actually operated. On paper, many camps maintained infirmaries, medical officers, and periodic inspections. These features were often cited in official correspondence as evidence of compliance with the Geneva Conventions. In practice, medical care was structured less around healing and more around maintaining a minimum level of functionality. The primary question for camp administrators was not whether a prisoner could recover fully, but whether she could still perform assigned tasks. Women prisoners occupied a particularly ambiguous position within this system. Unlike male POWs captured from uniformed armies, women were often classified under mixed categories: civilian internees, auxiliary personnel, resistance affiliates, or labor detainees. Each classification carried different obligations on the part of the detaining power, and camp authorities frequently exploited these ambiguities. Records suggest that medical provisioning for women was often treated as discretionary rather than mandatory, especially when supplies were scarce. The camp in which this woman was held followed a standard administrative model used across much of occupied Europe and parts of Asia. A central command issued regulations, while day-to-day decisions were left to local officers. Medical staff were present, but they operated under strict constraints. Medicines were rationed. Diagnostic tools were limited. Hospital transfers required approval from multiple layers of command. According to contemporary camp reports, requests for specialized treatment were frequently delayed or denied outright, particularly for prisoners deemed non-essential. The woman's condition emerged gradually in the records. Initial notes refer to persistent fatigue, dizziness, and swelling in the lower limbs. These symptoms were not unusual in camps where nutrition was tightly controlled. Daily rations were calculated to sustain basic survival, not long-term health. Protein deficiencies, vitamin shortages, and chronic dehydration were common. For women, these effects were often compounded by the lack of gender-specific medical attention. Menstrual health, for example, was rarely addressed in camp protocols, despite its relevance to overall physical stability. A brief medical entry notes that she collapsed during a work detail. Witnesses later recalled that such incidents were not uncommon and rarely prompted serious intervention. In her case, she was removed from the worksite and examined by a camp medic. The diagnosis was vague: general weakness. No underlying cause was identified, not because it was unknowable, but because investigation itself required resources the camp was unwilling to allocate. This pattern reflected a broader institutional logic. Camps were designed to extract labor while minimizing expenditure. Medical care functioned as a support service to that goal, not as an independent obligation. Prisoners who could work were kept working. Those who could not were reassigned, confined, or in some cases, simply neglected. Women who became medically fragile often fell into a gray zone. They were no longer productive, but they were also not prioritized for evacuation or hospital treatment. According to camp correspondence, the woman was eventually excused from heavy labor but assigned to lighter tasks, including sorting materials and cleaning administrative spaces. This reassignment was recorded as a humanitarian concession. In reality, it allowed the camp to avoid documenting her as fully incapacitated, which would have triggered additional reporting requirements. Her medical file notes continued deterioration, including weight loss and recurring infections. Antibiotics were reserved for acute cases among guards or prisoners deemed strategically important. One of the most revealing aspects of her case is not the severity of her illness, but the way it was described. Medical notes repeatedly emphasize her low resilience and reduced capacity, language that subtly shifted responsibility from conditions to the individual body. This framing was common. By portraying illness as a personal limitation rather than a systemic outcome, camp administrations insulated themselves from accusations of neglect. The broader context helps explain this choice of language. By the middle years of the war, many camps were under pressure from external observers, including neutral inspectors and humanitarian organizations. Reports were sanitized. Statistics were selectively presented. Serious illnesses were undercounted. Female prisoners, in particular, were often excluded from official tallies or grouped into non-combatant categories that received less scrutiny. Records suggest that the woman's condition eventually met the criteria for what camp doctors termed chronic debility. This classification carried no treatment protocol. It simply marked her as someone who should not be assigned strenuous labor. There is no indication that she was transferred to a hospital outside the camp. There's also no record of her receiving sustained medical care beyond basic observation. What makes this case historically valuable is its ordinariness. There is no dramatic incident, no single moment of crisis that demands attention. Instead, the file documents a slow erosion of health under conditions that were officially deemed acceptable. This is precisely how many medical failures in wartime captivity occurred, not through overt brutality, but through calculated neglect. From a policy perspective, the treatment of female prisoners revealed gaps in international conventions themselves. While the Geneva Conventions outline general standards for prisoner welfare, they were largely drafted with male combatants in mind. Women's specific medical needs were rarely addressed in detail. Detaining powers exploited this silence, interpreting obligations narrowly and inconsistently. Contemporary accounts indicate that women who reported medical issues were often viewed as complainers or malingerers, especially when their symptoms interfered with labor quotas. Camp culture rewarded endurance and punished vulnerability. In such an environment, seeking medical attention could carry risks, including reassignment to less desirable quarters or increased surveillance. The woman's file contains a final entry noting her removal from active duty lists. The reason given is persistent infirmity. There is no mention of recovery or further decline. The record simply ends. This absence is itself instructive. Many prisoner files terminate without resolution, reflecting the administrative reality that once a prisoner ceased to be useful, she also ceased to be documented in detail, returning to the larger historical picture. Her case illustrates how medical treatment in POW camps functioned less as care and more as management. Illness was tolerated so long as it did not disrupt operations. When it did, the response was to adjust the prisoner's role, not to address the underlying cause. For women, whose labor was often undervalued to begin with, This meant that medical neglect could proceed quietly, without triggering alarms. It also complicates narratives that draw a sharp distinction between camps that were overtly lethal and those considered merely harsh. The absence of mass mortality does not imply humane conditions. Chronic illness, untreated and unrecorded, left long-term consequences that wartime administrators neither acknowledged nor measured. In evaluating the war's impact on prisoners, historians have increasingly turned to such partial records, not because they offer complete stories, but because they reveal how systems operated when no one expected to be scrutinized closely. The woman's medical condition was not exceptional. It was typical of a system that regarded prisoners' bodies as resources to be conserved at the lowest possible cost. This is what her file ultimately reveals about camp treatment. Not a singular failure, but a structural one. Medical care existed, but it was calibrated to serve administrative priorities rather than human health. For female prisoners, whose presence already challenged existing categories, the consequences were especially severe. Their illnesses were noted, classified, and set aside, leaving behind a paper trail that speaks less about compassion than about control. Seen this way, her case does not ask for sympathy or judgment. It asks for clarity. It shows how war transforms medicine from a healing profession into a tool of governance, and how the effects of that transformation were inscribed quietly into the bodies of those who had little power to resist.